start. So I'm just gonna go ahead and say welcome to everybody who has made the time to be here. We really appreciate you guys, taking time out of your busy schedules. And I'm really excited about this particular event. This is our second Africa Over Coffee event of the term. My name is Debbie Aboa. I'm the chair of Africa Over Coffee for this school year. For those of you who are new to it, Africa Over Coffee is basically a Cambridge forum that is dedicated to the discussion of issues relevant to the African continent. We regularly have speakers join us on various topics, and today we're thrilled to have none other than our own esteemed alum, Nobesuthu Ngwenya. Please correct my pronunciation if I'm wrong. So Nobesuthu is an ecologist with the Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Management Authority. She has years of experience working as a researcher in national parks in Zimbabwe, and she holds a master's in conservation leadership from Cambridge. Her interests are in action-oriented and impact-driven conservation approaches for people and the planet. She's passionate about women in leadership in African society, sustainability, and large mammals of Africa. So welcome. Thank you so much for just making time in your busy schedule. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I just wanted you to start by filling us in on anything else I've missed out in your bio and talking a little bit about what conservation entails for those of us who have a very elementary understanding of it.
Okay, thank you very much, Debbie, for the introduction, and thank you very much for having me and also for successfully hosting this session. Yeah, I used to really enjoy Africa Over Coffee sessions when I was in Cambridge, and I think it's great that we can now do them even over Zoom despite the pandemic. Absolutely. Yeah, thanks. So just to give a background of what I'm going to talk about, I hope it's okay for me to share my screen, because I was aware that we actually have people from different backgrounds who might not be familiar with conservation, who might actually benefit if I actually do introduce conservation. So let me try and share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Not yet. It usually takes a few seconds to load.
Okay, let me try it again.
Okay. Okay. Yes, we can see.
Okay, great. Yeah. So you asked me to talk about conservation in Africa and how actually conservationists are leading conservation in Africa, actually. So I hope I actually do justice to what I've been asked to do, but I just prepared the presentation on Africa and Africans in the conservation space. Mm-hmm. So just to give a disclaimer, the views that I'm going to share during this presentation, actually my own views. I do belong to certain groups and I also work for an organization in Zimbabwe, but I just want you to know that the views that I'm going to share don't represent any of the organizations or the groups that I'm part of. They are all my own views. And just to give an outline of what I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to give a background of conservation in Africa, the strides in conservation so far in Africa, women in conservation science. This, I particularly brought it in because a week ago, we're actually celebrating women in conservation science. And also I'll share my journey in conservation science as a woman. And also from there, we can now discuss and talk about take-home messages from the discussion.
Perfect. Covered all the questions I wanted to ask.
Okay. So what is conservation? So it is defined as the active management of the biosphere to ensure the survival of the maximum diversity of species and the maintenance of genetic variability within species. So in short and non-technical scientific terms, we're saying that this is the prevention of wasteful use of natural resources, protecting and restoring the natural environment. So if we talk about nature, we're now talking about the ecosystem services that it provides. We're talking about the clean water that we see in the natural rivers. We're talking of our natural heritage in Africa, our national parks, which I'll be referring to as protected areas, because they are protected for the preservation of our wildlife, our animals, and also for the habitat. And also when we're not talking about conservation, we think of the clean air that we're actually receiving from the natural environment. And also I hope that we are aware that conservation is also important for our mental well-being and also for our health. I think since we're actually within this period of COVID-19, I think really this has been a wake-up call for us on how we play a role in conservation. If we look at the diseases that we've been facing from SARS, COVID-19, which are being linked to practices that are actually against nature conservation. So all this now actually narrows down to everyone playing a role in nature conservation. So basically, this is how I would like to pack conservation for this specific talk. So if we look at conservation in Africa, we have I was actually looking at what really is common in Africa. And I thought that Agenda 2063 aspirations really speak to conservation for the continent. And also there's a shared goal for the African continent, since we're actually talking about Africa at this point. So I'm just going to narrow down to aspiration 1 and aspiration 6, because these are quite specific to conservation. And so if you look at aspiration 1 of Agenda 2063, it speaks to a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. And it says that by 2063, Africa's unique natural endowments, its environment and ecosystem, including its wildlife and wildlands, are healthy, valued, and protected, with climate resilient economies and communities. So this really speaks to what we want to achieve in the Africa we want by 2063. And also aspiration 6, which says by the Africa of 2063 should be the one whose development is people-driven, relying on the potential of African people, especially its women and youth, and caring for children. And specifically, it calls for an Africa of 2063, which will have full gender parity, with women occupying at least 50% of elected public offices at all levels, and half of the managerial positions in the public and in the private sectors. So the economic and political glass ceiling that is restricting women's progress at the moment by then should have been shattered. So I really feel like those aspirations speak to what we really would want to see for conservation in Africa. though 2063 to me feels like really it might be a long time from now, and we should actually start working on this and probably might even be able to achieve this in the next 5 years. I don't see what is stopping us, but I think this is really important and something that we should have, and we have in common as Africa, and I think every country wants to achieve for nature conservation. So looking at Africa, its contribution so far to the cause, that is conservation. So far, we're saying that currently Africa actually contributes less than 5% of carbon emissions, but we bear the most impact of climate change effects. So this is where really Africa needs to play a role in actually contributing to the mitigation of climate change impacts, because we're really on the receiving end. If we look at the cyclones that we've really been receiving lately, I mean, if we look at Mozambique, I think Mozambique has really been hard hit by cyclones recently. And even at the moment, we really have this unstable climate and also droughts, regular droughts, which are actually being experienced in the country, even in protected areas. We actually have animals dying from drought because of the impacts of climate change. So this really is important to us. And as Africa, we should work on implementing measures that will ensure that we are able to adapt to climate change and also preserve our natural heritage at the same time. So if we look at the map that is on the right side of the screen there, it represents the global protected areas. These are our national parks, our community conserved areas, all which contain nature, right? So you find that the target for protected areas, actually, which was set globally, was supposed to have terrestrial coverage of 17% by 2020. And now we're at 17.8. We actually only achieved 15.4% coverage of terrestrial protected areas. This is globally. But if we look at the map there, if you look at Africa, I am from Zimbabwe, in the southern part of Africa. And you can actually see that the national parks and the protected areas that we have so far, they exceed the 17% coverage, which is actually which was the target that was set. So some of the countries in Africa actually exceeding the target. So Africans are really playing a role in conserving our nature, and through an example of protected areas, which I'm quite familiar with because of my background, where I work, and also where with my work placement, we actually worked on the post-2020 CBD target 11, which focused on protected areas. So this is also, if we look at the marine protected areas, unfortunately, I didn't put the map here. We have exceeded the target of 10% that was set, and globally now we have 17.8 marine and coastal areas being protected. And this is the natural resource that makes Africa proud, and really we should be benefiting from and enjoying the benefits of nature. So you find that in our protected areas, they're actually local communities that live adjacent to our national parks, and actually also dependent on these natural resources, which is really one of the reasons why it's important for us to be able to protect them. So also one of the achievements for Africa, I think, is that the number of community-based conservation programs has actually been increasing in the past, I think, 20 years now, where we have a lot of community conserved areas being put in place and communities benefiting from there, playing a role in decision-making and all. So yes, we do have a long way to go there, but I think it's also commendable, something that's commendable of us in Africa, that we're actually working towards it. So Africa today, in terms of conservation, Africa supports, as I've already mentioned, large populations of large mammals, which include African elephants. For example, we have our lions, our leopards, our rhinos being part of those magnificent populations. And we also have close to like 2,000 key biodiversity areas. And so you find that also conservation is actually contributing to revenue at national level. I thought I was hoping that I wouldn't mention GDP because this is something that I think we should run away from and also just focus on our natural capital as in the value of our nature instead of just the financial bit of it. But anyway, the revenue that's generated from the sector through tourism is actually over 25 billion US dollars annually. And it said that it employs about 3.6 million people in the sector. And also there's revenue that's obtained from hunting, which is over or approximately 200 million US dollars annually. And also this was prior to COVID-19 because during the lockdown, there weren't any, there were minimal tourism activities. And so there was really limited income coming in for conservation. And yeah, there were really some challenges faced by countries, especially in Africa, in terms of funding the conservation activities on the ground. But yes, conservation does contribute and also can actually generate revenue to sustain the protected areas and the people living around it benefiting from these activities. So the key threats really include habitat loss, because we really cannot ignore the fast-growing population of Africa and the increased demand for the natural resource and space. So this is where habitat loss comes in. And there's also illegal wildlife trade, which is driven by demand, and also there are issues to do with poverty, where we actually have people engaging into illegal activities because they actually might need money to sustain themselves in the poverty in which they are in. And also their impacts of climate change and of course poor governance. So now, having said all this, what I would like each one of us to think about is what really comes to mind if conservation is mentioned, and what comes to mind if we talk about conservation in your own country and in your own space. So just to mention that in my country, in Zimbabwe, where I come from, conservation is actually a very important sector. But there's an interesting view to conservation also, which is accompanied by its history and where we are now, because it has been a male-dominated field, and also a field that has been dominated by the white community. So my former professor used to say that conservation in Africa has for a long time been viewed as a field of white men in khaki pants. And also a friend of mine, Nomsa, recently actually wrote a publication where she actually mentions that Africans, Black Africans, we have become comfortable in thinking that conservation is really not our thing. It's not something that interests us. And I think this is really a wrong impression, because most Black African conservationists might really feel like they do not have a role to play in conservation. Whereas really how I feel about it is conservation should be driven by Africans in Africa, and also owned by the Africans, such that everyone plays a role and contributes towards conservation. I think if there was that ownership and understanding of, the role that everyone needs to play in conservation, we would really be at a better position. We wouldn't be talking about people poisoning animals out there, because they do feel that ownership, and people do understand that they have to play a role in conservation. And also, one of the things that I would like to, a question that I would like to pose is, we're recently celebrating International Women in Science Day. And what sort of support have we been receiving, as women? And also, if you're not a woman, part of the attendees here, what role have you played to support this cause? So this is a question that I would like everyone to keep in mind till the end of the presentation. And also, one other question is, as an individual and also as a society, what contribution to conservation are you making? And then one last thing that I'm going to talk about is the issue of plastic bottled water. So I really sometimes do feel embarrassed when I attend meetings, especially conservation meetings, and then you find that plastic bottled water is being issued and we're using it. Yes, we do have a water crisis in Africa. But then at the same time, I was having this conversation with a friend of mine where she said that, oh, well, what's wrong with, well, I was just telling her how I felt about plastic water bottles. And she said to me, oh, I thought plastic bottled water was an in thing, So there actually are people out there who still feel like plastic bottled water is an in thing, when yet it's actually it's having an impact on our environment and also our natural resources. So yes, we're still using plastic.
Hello? Okay, sorry, I can't tell whether this is my connection or whether Nobe's connection.
For me too, I think it's Nobes, yeah.
Okay.
Zimbabwe internet is not the best.
Okay, so we're just, okay, there she is. She's back. Hello? Okay.
Hello, okay.
Okay, sorry.
So I think the internet just dropped. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay, so I was just...
Reshare your screen.
Oh, I need to share my screen again, okay. Can you see my screen now?
Yes. If you could put your video back on, and then we'll just...
I think I'll just keep it off for now, so that the internet, the broadband actually can sustain me.
Okay.
Okay. So I was just saying that since we have actually achieved so much in terms of conservation, we have our protected areas, we have our magnificent species such as elephants, wild dogs, lions, we have our beautiful forests all out there. We're protecting them. They're all under protected areas. And we're actually making strides. There's a time, I think it was last year, when Kenya actually put a ban on plastic waste. And everyone was really happy. I was like, wow, I really feel like we're actually getting somewhere with the issue of plastics. And now probably some African governments are actually going to copy as well and learn from what Kenya has done. And then later in the year, New York Times publishes an article where it stated that they're actually having negotiations between the West and Kenya, so that Kenya would actually reverse its ban. So that was really like a setback. and a disappointment as well for conservationists in Africa. And so we actually developed a position statement with regards to that issue of the influx of plastic waste by international fossil fuel and chemical companies into Africa, which I think it's also something that we need to keep an eye on, because it's still an emerging issue since China banned, it's no longer receiving waste into China. So now where is the next destination for plastic waste going to be? And we can see that it's actually coming to Africa. And so this is where we're like, as Africans, we should really stand up and know what we really want, and also and also encourage our governments to transition from plastic dependence and adopt the extended producer responsibility, and enforce also the Basel Convention. So also that's why really this issue of plastics is of concern, and really need to have this conversation as Africans, and also as individuals. We all need to be sensitive of our environment and be responsible for our actions, such that we reduce actually our environmental footprint. Moving on. Okay, so this was the call from the publication, that African leaders reject proposals to import plastic waste into Africa. So what are the other limitations as well for conservation in Africa? You find that some of the decisions are mostly influenced externally, and the needs of those living with wildlife are not considered most of the times. So, you find that there's so many publications, like I don't think we go for over a week without any report or publication on people being killed by wildlife, so local communities are really affected, and they are really on the receiving end when it comes to, living with nature, because they are adjacent to protected areas, to our national parks, and the animals do actually, though they don't know any boundaries, they move around a lot, and they get into local communities, they destroy the crops and all. And also, I would like to also recognize that we have a growing population, so there's increased demand for space, and there's encroachment also into these protected areas. So there's really need for us as Africa to come up with the position and ways in which we can encourage coexistence between humans and wildlife. So also, the other limitation is that the benefits from nature to local communities might actually be limited due to restrictions, for example, when it comes to issues of trade and use of wildlife resources. So just to give a background, before national parks and protected areas or other protected areas were established, people used to live in those areas, and people were moved, right? So people used to live people were moved to create space for wildlife. And now, because of the separation, really, we do have people and local communities suffering. And then there are actually efforts that have been made to ensure that communities also benefit from living with nature. So you find that some of the revenue that's collected from tourism might actually not be enough to sustain the local communities, because most of it is actually lost to leakages. So if you really do the accounting, you can see that what really ends up getting to the local communities is it might be little, it might not really do much. But now we really need to come up with innovative ways to actually ensure that there's that mutual benefit, and also that local communities become the center for conservation, and also have the buy-in to conservation and understand why we need to conserve and also play a role. So instead of feeling like they are really excluded because they were moved from the protected areas, or it's really not their thing, as I mentioned earlier. So these are some of the limitations that we're facing in conservation. whilst we have those limitations, yes, we are making strides. Black women are making strides in conservation. When I actually was thinking of strides in conservation, I realized that the history of conservation is so male-dominated, and we have so many men who have been successful in conservation. But there's one woman who really struck my attention, Wangari Maathai. I think up to now, she might be I think she was the first Nobel Prize winner, Peace Prize winner. And she really contributed to conservation and started the Green Belt movement. And this was in the 1970s. So she's really like one Black African woman who really made that impact in conservation. And then from then up to now, there are some women who have really made strides in conservation. Forgive me, the examples that I'm going to give actually Zimbabwean conservationists, female conservationists, because I am from Zimbabwe, so I'm going to be a bit biased here. So we actually have female rangers now being employed and contributing to conservation and making strides, being in the field, also contributing to conservation. There is actually one of the latest that I have there, Olivia. She's really one phenomenal woman who really is doing great work in conservation and encouraging women in conservation. And she always told me that, just work hard and let your work speak for itself. And really till today, that's exactly what I am doing. Then we have More Angels in Oxford alum, and she's really doing well. I think she's one of the Black African women who have given TED Talks on conservation. And also there's one other phenomenal and powerful woman, Mrs. Tom, who was the first female ranger in Zimbabwe and is still working in the conservation sector till date. And also another woman whom I think is really powerful and is having an impact in conservation. She's, I think, the first woman professor within the government working as an executive director and also having a professorship really, and for an African society and from the background and the history of conservation, it really isn't something that comes by easily, and it requires everything that people do in conservation, especially women. Really, they work so hard to get where they are, and really by the time you get noticed and people appreciate the impact that you are having in the field, you would have really put in that extra mile. And so I think the work that they are doing is really commendable. And also there are many other women who have really played a role, especially in my career, whom I have seen and also learned from, and actually making great strides in conservation. And which is why I really feel like this is an important conversation for us to have, and also see how best we can continue growing and promoting women in conservation. So what is the crisis when it comes to gender? So many publications have mentioned that in the conservation sector, there are actually fewer women receiving leadership opportunities as compared to men with the same qualification. And then you find that women also occupy junior positions, and men are promoted quicker than women, even if they might actually not have a qualification that's close to you as a woman, they still get that preference. And also issues that have been highlighted also include experiences that some women have had in the field, and some I've also had myself. So some of the experiences include that maybe you might find that there are less competent men holding senior positions, for example. And then if you are in a meeting, for instance, also as a woman, you're being talked over. And also, if a woman is successful and they're doing well, most of the times it is linked to bottom power, which I feel really is not fair, because it really does not look at the merit or what that woman is really capable of and what they have achieved on their own. So, you know, every single time you find that is now just linked to bottom power, and nothing is actually, no credit is given to the work that you're doing and the achievements that you've made, which I think is a problem. And also you find that there are some women who also can actually be contributing to that, and that some women are really not, as women, were not supportive enough of each other. So whilst we're talking about gender now, and there are all those issues, it also, when I was actually thinking about it and preparing this presentation, it made me wonder if this is a conversation that we are yet to have in conservation in Africa, or what, or is this the beginning, really? I feel like this is a conversation that we really need to have, is Africa, and how we can actually deal with it, and also deal with the system itself. So if you look at, well, there's this article by Peter Lindsay, which stated that tourism generates 40% more full-time jobs, you know, and then it employs proportionally more women than other sectors, which made me wonder, like what you're saying, it employs more women, but now no one talks about the role that women in conservation actually occupy. You might find that maybe most of the women that are being mentioned there actually might be in junior positions. And also, if we look at there's an analysis that was done by IUCN, which actually analyzed the inclusion of gender as a key word in convention reports that are linked to conservation. So we have a Ramsar convention, which is actually most focused on wetlands. So you find, so it was actually said that gender in the Ramsar convention reports is mentioned only 16% time. And then in the World Heritage Convention, it's only mentioned 1% of the time in the reports. So meaning really this is a conversation that we need to have, and it's really being overlooked and it's not mentioned in our reports, and I think it's really a cause of concern. The national biodiversity strategies and action plans, the issue of women empowerment and gender equality it was found that it was only mentioned 18% of the time. So this really is a cause of concern, and I think we can do better. And also, definitely, this also is a relevant issue for Africa, though those figures are all global based. So moving on now, I'm just going to share about my journey as a woman in science. My background, really, being a Black African woman, I cannot say when I grew up, I grew up with nature, and oh no, that's not true. I grew up in the city, and I really didn't know what conservation was up until I was like 17. So I grew up in the city, and when I grew up, really, because of certain challenges, like in Africa, I think even up to now, career guidance courses and all might really be very limited or not existing at all in some institutions. So, those were like the gaps, because we really didn't know what conservation was. Up until I went to university, all I knew was I really wanted to do something that was related to the environment, protecting the environment and all, because I did like the environment. I grew up in the city, but I loved trees and all. So yeah, and then the first time I actually had contact with nature was when I was 20, and worked for an amazing NGO, which was led by a woman. And this was like, I think the best part of it, because really it was so encouraging to see a woman and working with a woman who's so passionate about her work, and also encouraging you to actually grow in the field and contribute to nature. So really, AWCF, African Wildlife Conservation Fund, gave me that induction to nature, and I really actually got to see wild dogs for the first time when I was with the organization and, you know, looking at it up close, really this was, I feel like, the kickstart of my career and motivation working with women in the sector. So yeah, and then from there, I still love war dogs. Every time I see war dogs, yeah, my heart just skips. And so I continued and I joined the Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Management Authority as an ecologist. So now I'm involved in research and also policy. And I'm really passionate about bridging the gap between research and policy, and most of all, implementing the policy and ensuring that it's translated to ground level, to the local level, and to ensure that we achieve our conservation goals. So what I just included this picture on the bottom right, where we're doing work with the local communities in the protected areas surrounding our, in the Manapus National Park. So when I do all this work, sometimes you find that even when we attend some meetings and all, the representation of women is still very low. And you might actually attend a meeting and be the only woman there. So yeah, I think this is actually a red flag. And then from there, actually, I came to Cambridge, and yes, I'm passionate about elephants as well. As a chevening scholar, I actually attended Cambridge for my master's. What I find, actually, when I edit the picture that is on the far right, I think this was one event where I actually felt like, am I an imposter in conservation? And what am I actually doing? So my supervisor actually asked me to comment on his book on sustainable development in Africa. And he mentioned that when he was writing the book and editing it, he couldn't find any females interested in contributing to the book. And as I was standing there, looking like I knew what I was doing and someone who knew what she was saying, deep down inside, I was thinking, wow, what am I doing here? If there weren't any women who contributed to this work, who am I to actually review and comment on the book now in front of this huge audience and representatives from big organizations and all? So I was nervous. I felt like an imposter. But at the same time, I think this was the very day I really got to think twice and really had it entrenched in me that conservation should be owned by everyone. And as a woman, I had a role to play. So yeah, I think this was a big break for me. So I was nervous, but I think up to today, it really made that difference. And I think also as women in whatever field we are in, as long as whether we're in science or we're in conservation, we take ownership of what we do and really think of the cause that we're going to contribute to, instead of thinking that we're imposters. No, I think really that is a negative feeling and syndrome that we should not even entertain. And even if you're not an expert in conservation, I think everyone should be a conservationist at heart and also contribute to the cause for conservation. Yeah, so till today, this is me. I'm still in the field working with men, being a woman in science. And I'm really happy with my work. I love what I do. And yeah, that's me. So take-home messages from the presentation is conservation is important for human life, and we should be environmentally sensitive and be responsible towards conserving our heritage. We all have a role to play in conservation, and we need to, by all means, work towards reducing our ecological footprint. There's a statement that I actually took from Chevening, which says that the future belongs to those who create it. Though 2063 seems to be far for us to achieve the Africa we want, it is what we do today that will determine how we achieve our goals. And also, plastic bottled water is not an in thing. And for us to achieve transformative change, it all begins with us. Achieving equity in women in leadership roles is important for a better world. And really, both men and women should play a role towards this cause. And I'm really optimistic about nature conservation because I know that everyone who is part of this talk now is a conservationist already. Yeah. Thank you, Debbie, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. That was very, very thorough. I think it definitely exceeded my expectations of what you'd be able to cover today. I think that was a very good overview. We're going to open it up to the audience to ask questions, but just before people ask their questions, I had a question to ask you. So you mentioned poor governance as a key threat to conservation work. How significant is policy development, and how can governments be lobbied to take these policy proposals seriously? I mean, how do we actually get them to prioritize the natural environment over short-term economic gains from activities such as, I don't know, mining, in at least the Ghanaian example? Yeah.
That's a really good question, Debbie. And yeah, I think this is one problem that all conservationists are always cracking our heads with. And I think I mentioned earlier that I didn't want to talk about GDP because I really think that we shouldn't be measuring our achievements and successes in terms of development using GDP when we're so rich with natural resources and everything that is around us. So when it comes to issues of governance, you find that in terms of conservation, most of the protected areas are actually owned by governments, for example. And the issue of ownership when it comes to land and all, you find that there are really probably very few places which are owned by local communities. So now this issue of governance and what the role the communities can play in conservation is now comes into play, because the moment you don't feel like you own that land, or when you feel like you don't own nature, then what effort are you going to put in place to actually conserve it or conserve the land? You see, so this is where the issues of governance come in, and there's need to build capacity in local communities and also empower them such that they can actually do this on their own, you know, and also push for the conservation agenda and benefit from it at the same time. And then you also mentioned the issue of policies, prioritizing conservation. I think the issue of policies, I mean, Africa has such good policies and everything that we have on paper, brilliant. But now when it comes to implementing and putting work into practice, that's where I feel like the challenge is. So what actually is limiting might actually be the issue of buy-in again. How many people buy into conservation? How many people understand the issue of conservation, the value of conservation? And also, if you look at the funding for implementing all the policies that we have such good policies, but then also the funds might actually be limiting in terms of implementing all that we actually plan and set for ourselves. Yeah.
Going back to your comment on the ownership of the actual land, I was just thinking about, I mean, in Ghana, different regions kind of have different laws around this. So in the Ashanti region where I'm from, the land is owned by chiefs. I mean, well, totally it's owned by the Asantene, I suppose. But chiefs are the ones who sell it. So actually, I was just complaining. I'm not in the Ashanti region now, but I'm basically bordering the eastern region. So there's a hill like right behind my house, and it's been completely just raised. Like all the vegetation is gone. Like I came back one day and it was just gone. And I was just thinking, looking at the incline of the hill, you can't really build something there. So why would the chief think that this is a priority to sell? Why would he not think about, I mean, first of all, the aesthetics, but secondly, just like conserving the species that probably live there, thinking about erosion. I mean, it's quite scary. Now there's like no plant cover there.
Yeah.
So it's just like, what are people? Yeah, I think it really comes back to that education factor and people understand what they'll get from it, and thinking over the money that they have in hand.
Right.
So it's kind of a worrying issue, I think.
Yeah, it is, but I will tell you what Namibia actually has done. Namibia really, I think, is sort of leading when it comes to community conserved areas, because they now actually have conservances, what you call conservances, which are owned by the community. So there's actually funding that's put in place towards conserving nature by the communities. So all the work that's done there, the people who are employed working in the conservancy, actually the local communities. And I think they're also working towards building capacity in local communities so that they're actually able to manage the conservancies themselves and also benefit from that.
Okay, that's very interesting. I wonder whether some of our countries can look, I mean, there are policies in place in other African countries. I mean, it would be great if Ghana would just look at our neighbors and borrow and adapt. But anyway, let me open the floor to the audience. I see someone has their hand up. You can just go ahead and unmute your mic and ask your question.
Thank you very much, Nobes, for a wonderful presentation and for sharing your ideas with us. I'm Austin, I'm in Lusaka, Zambia. So my question to Nobes is, you touched on the issue of Africans not really participating so much in conservation. It appears to me that mostly tourists are non-Africans who come for wildlife on the African continent. Don't you think Africans are simply bearing the cost of conserving in expectation for money from outside Africa? What's your take on that?
Thank you for your question, Austin. That's a very tricky one, because it also brings the question, like, whom are we conserving nature for? So I think the moment we understand whom we're conserving nature for, then we'll understand why we do some of the things we do. So we might say that communities are just bearing the cost of living with nature. But also, we also must remember that they are also benefiting from conserving nature. If we look at how dependent they are on natural resources, I mean, if you have the rivers that are flowing throughout, that is your water supply, the clean air around them. So yes, the communities are benefiting. Whilst it's true that the tourism industry is dominated by internationals, I think the gap there is like, even up to now, I feel like I've missed out a lot. I think my childhood, I missed out a lot on conservation because I never had a chance to visit protected areas. And up to now, I don't even understand why. Why didn't we even go to national parks? And it's the question that I always ask my mom, why didn't you take us there? But the thing is, national parks are expensive. And some of the charges actually might only be afforded by internationals. And as locals, I mean, we cannot really deny the fact that when it comes to finances, and or we might not really be able to afford tourism. So whilst those are the issues that those are actually the effects, the issue of tourism as well, even if it's actually benefiting internationals as well, there's also an issue of revenue, money that is coming in from there, you see. So whilst the communities who are living with nature and bearing the cost of living with nature are benefiting, as long as they are benefiting from the tourism, yes, they will continue and encourage tourism because they're benefiting from it. I'll give an example of campfire when it started in Zimbabwe. So campfire encouraged hunting, right? So when hunting was being done, people benefited. Schools were built, hospitals were built, and some social amenities was actually built, which contributed to the development of the local community, right? So if you can conserve and benefit in that sense at the end of the day, I think that actually strikes the balance between conservation and also the local communities bearing the cost of living with nature.
Thank you for that.
Thanks, Nobs. That's I think that explanation is makes a lot of sense. There are benefits for them as a contribution to managing the ecosystem, and also financial benefits that flow through tourism activities. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to ask a question? Just go ahead and raise your hand or unmute your mic.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Enough. My question has to do with, or maybe I can sneak in two questions. The first one is just, communities seem to have very little voice and power, like to influence the way politics is done. So they may get benefits from wildlife and so forth, but are those in power really interested in making these rural communities happy? And how might that be a barrier? How could their voices and their needs be made to be more kind of politically expedient? Like Debbie was saying, like with the, how can we get it onto the politicians' agenda at the high level that communities are important? Or maybe you disagree, maybe politicians already believe that. I'll just leave it at that question for now. How can we get around that problem?
Thank you, Tim, for the question. Yeah, the issue of the voice of the communities is really important. And, you know, you find that the loudest voice is the voice that is heard, and sometimes, most of the times, adopted. And this is like a limitation, you know, of community conservation, the role of local communities in conservation. So, yeah, I think everything at the end of the day really boils down to leadership. It's an issue of leadership. What type of leadership do we have in the society and also in the communities? Do the communities really understand and know what they want, and how best can they push for that? So I think it just really comes back to leadership. I think if you have a strong and good leadership, and a competent leadership as well, that understands all those issues, then I think it will be a better way of achieving transformative change towards ensuring that communities really benefit and also have a role to play in conservation. So yes, the voices might not be as powerful, and the influence of those who are powerful in the political spheres also comes into play. But I think what we really need at the moment is a strong and good leadership to be able to achieve this change. I think this is also similar also when it comes to the role of women in conservation. I think also here we can say the voice of women might not really be as loud. I think it's actually similar also to communities. But why is that so? Why is it not heard? Why is it that women are not heard enough? No, I think it also comes back to the system. So how do we change that system? So to be able to really change that system, it also has to start with us, and it requires good leadership to be able to tackle such problems. And so, yes, I really feel like Africa needs more good leaders. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a wild dog on my wall as well. I also love them.
Oh, that's great.
Great. So we're going to move on to Patience. She has a question. Patience, if you could just unmute and ask your question, please.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, it's just a short one. Thanks very much, Nobesuthu, for a brilliant presentation and nice talk. I wanted to ask you if you were to be 40 and you are the Minister of Environment and Conservation, what message would you give to the youth in conservation in Africa to make conservation count?
Thank you very much for that question. I think my message to the youth, and I think it will also apply probably to everyone else, I'll adopt it from the chevening words. We say that the future belongs to those who create it. It is up to the youth to create the future and also make the change that they want to see. So I would really encourage the youth and everyone to actually play their role and be active in actually in all sectors of life, be it in issues to do with conservation, be it in issues to do with equity. And I really think that being bold and also calling for what we want or what the youth want is really important and plays a great role towards achieving what the future in the transformative change that we want to see. Yeah, I think that would be my advice.
Very well put. Obviously, I have a huge interest in this as my focus is education. And I've just been really thinking about how we can integrate this sort of dialogue into curricula and how that needs to be prioritized, and whether it's science education or whether it's its own, or whether it's its own sort of separate club or class. I mean, it just needs to be prioritized. But I had another question before. Guys, you can continue raising your hands. But I have a quick question. So it's still around governance, but I was just kind of thinking through the impacts of imperialism or continuing impacts of imperialism. So you mentioned the plastic waste issue in Kenya, and how the West is putting pressure on Kenya to reverse it so that they can throw their trash in our countries. I mean, Ghana has a problem with huge e-waste dumps. You can only imagine, how detrimental that is to the environment with all of these toxic metals seeping into the soil. Very scary. But yeah, I mean, the fact that this is even allowed, that countries are importing, or I guess exporting their trash and we're just receiving it. I think there was also another issue, I want to say in East Africa, was it Rwanda? Please correct me if I'm wrong, with secondhand clothing and it being banned in these countries. And of course, there being pressure to allow those imports, which of course is also problematic because of the microplastics in the clothing. I mean, there's so many issues that I don't know, it's just very surprising how hypocritical, or maybe it's not very surprising, how hypocritical the West is being when it comes to conservation efforts, by pretty much just shunting their trash over to our continent. Yeah, can you kind of speak on that?
Yeah, Debbie, that's a very tricky conundrum, right? Because, you know, I think if we look at the US during Trump's reign, conservation wasn't priority, see? And, you know, the US withdrew from many platforms where they could have really contributed towards conservation. They opened up coal mines, which were closed by Obama, for example. You know, so there was a lot that was happening, and there is a lot that is still happening. And, you know, I think the fact that the systems that are driving the world at the moment are all based on GDP and money.
Yeah.
So there is that trade. I don't even want to call it a trade-off, because I don't think it should be a trade-off. It shouldn't be that way. But then it's now an issue of priorities, because the understanding and the measure that we're using for growth in countries is still based on money, still financial. So as long as that is still there and countries are fighting to be the world powers and be at the top using GDP, then it's really difficult. And yes, they might actually seem hypocritical. But yeah, I mean, it also boils down at the end of the day to the issue of leadership, you see. Yeah. So now the US has a new leadership and everything is now starting to change. See, so yeah, there is that effect that really the issue of GDP is still playing a big role in terms of development and measuring growth, and also at the same time, the issue of leadership.
Sorry, to me, this is just, there's always a problem, because it just seems like it's hard to see where to place the pressure.
Right.
Because our local, you know, our leadership in our individual countries are being pressured by the West, pressured to overlook their own national interests for finance. Yeah.
But then what's stopping us is Africa from being independent.
Yeah.
We have natural resources. We have beautiful countries, beautiful landscapes. And yeah, I mean, this is where I feel like, you know, as Africa, we can be independent and we can actually push for what interests us, as long as we follow the policies that we develop, which I really feel like most of them are spot on, and could address most of our problems. But Africa has the potential. Africa is rich. Africa has all the resources and everything we need to have a healthy and happy and have happy lives. You know.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm just gonna continue to allow people to ask questions. Please go ahead, unmute your mic or raise your hand.
Ale?
Yeah, Ed. Martin, is it?
Yes, sure.
Okay, please go ahead.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Nobesuthu, for the very stimulating presentation, which I found, very interesting, but also, just some, raising some key, elements and questions, which I think are important. So I would just like to touch on just one or two issues. I think the first, which you highlighted, which is important, is the issue of, the need for more women to be more active in conservation. Perhaps, given my experience from, being in academia, what, we are seeing over the years is that, especially in Zimbabwe, we have seen more ladies or more females, basically, dominating most of these, conservation or environmental programs, which I think is a positive, dimension. We hope they will also feel, some of the key roles in terms of, conservation, leaders, and also become, practitioners in that area. So I think, there is that, dimension, which I think is essential in terms of governments actually trying to tackle the issue of capacity and also issues of gender by allowing that, the baseline for training, actually tackles the STEM, and also ensuring that, the girl child is actually empowered, which is very, very essential for future roles. And then I think the second issue, which is, of interest, is the issue of when we look at women in conservation and in terms of leadership. It could be leadership in management, but also leadership in research. I think we see a big, gap there. And what do I mean? So we need to encourage, ladies, particularly those that are in conservation, to continue, with the research, but also aiming for higher degrees. But I think in that way, we help ourselves to have more voices coming from, do research at high level, both even, doing, innovative and also research that influences, science, policy, and also the issue of innovation. We see a very big drop in terms of women that are more, are influential, especially from the African perspective. So I think that's one area where we would then be able to say, even if we have scientists that are, ecologists, biologists, we need then to be able to say, let's aim and let's incentivize, more research, more higher level studies, so that we are able to close the gap, and also have female conservationists that are leading in terms of impact for research, impact for conservation. So I think that's something which we need to look at. And I'm happy that even as an alumni of Cambridge, University, you're actually showing the positive impact that your master's degree has done. So then the wish and hope would be then to go ahead and also do the PhD and be able to have more such, rigor in terms of research and also impact at higher level. So I thought I would just want to put that, as part of a discussion point, but also as a target for us to move forward the conservation agenda and also the gender equity that we talk about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. I think that was very clear and also a contribution, and I think it's very valuable. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Please go ahead if you have any more questions.
Well, just to mention, I think Edson has brought up very good and interesting points. You mentioned the gap in terms of innovation and encouraging women to be even more innovative and playing a role in conservation. I think it is important, and women to have the potential to be more innovative and bring change in conservation. But what I've actually seen, and also I think this has been mentioned in some researches that have been done, is that when we talk about the quota system, where we're saying that maybe in leadership positions, we might call for 50% being women and 50% being men, right? So actually calling for 50-50 positions there. You might find that the person who's making the decision on whom to include in the leadership position might actually be a man, because already they're holding the senior positions. And also, if you look at the women that actually might actually be engaged or placed in those roles, you know, they might not actually, I think that the right way is you end up having, you might actually have more incompetent people in holding leadership positions. And this actually, at the end of the day, sort of confirms the weakness in women in terms of being good leaders, because the people that they are holding that maybe the quota might not actually be there from merit. So I think the issue of innovation and recognizing the value and the knowledge that women out there have is important, and also that recognition should be should actually be affected considering merit as well.
Very good point. Okay, if someone's not jumping in to ask a question, I'm going to ask another one. So I wanted to know, I think for many of us, maybe we haven't had a specific concentration on conservation, but we've had a lot of conversations or heard a lot of talk around the impacts of climate change specifically. I just wanted to ask, so what can students like us or citizens like us in our respective countries do practically day to day? If we're not pursuing careers in conservation, what can we specifically do? Yeah, just to support the efforts that people like you are making, and the impacts that you're making in your field. Is it the same sort of things we've been hearing about climate change and, you know, recycle, or is there something more?
Well, there's actually a lot, Debbie, that we can actually, everyone can actually do to contribute to conservation. I think the first ASCU symposium conference that I attended, there were actually plastic bottled water was actually being served at the conference. I think we can start from there, you know. How much are we contributing to plastic waste as individuals? So that is one starting point. And there's also something that I actually learned when I got to Cambridge in the department. So the department is a policy of like this no meat policy.
Oh, okay.
So people were actually going to be, encourage that people be vegetarian. So initially I did not understand why there was that policy. And I was like, I'm not going to be part of this until I understand what it means. So I think in the first 2 days, I was eating meat in the department, and then later on, I sat down with colleagues and friends. I needed to understand it. Here in, I think, Africa, we don't have, those factories where people grow meat and stuff. And that has really been seen to contribute a lot to carbon emissions and climate change eventually, So yes, I think discouraging consumption of non-environmentally friendly
sorry to be like that.
And also, any equipment. I think actually also ended up becoming cautious of where my clothing was coming from, because I now understood like some of the things are not sustainably produced. So I think just being wary of the products or your consumption and what actually you're promoting through your consumption. At the end of the day, you'd rather go organic and also for sustainably produced goods, you know. And also, I think the one thing that I liked about Cambridge is it's a cycling city. So mostly people, I mean, intellectuals, students, and professionals cycle wherever they go. So you actually really, that is environmentally friendly. And I really wish that the world and Africa could actually also try and minimize carbon emissions and encourage cycling, which is also healthy as well. I really enjoy it and I miss that. It's not safe to cycle here, but I feel like I think we could do better, you know, encourage cycling and have cycle tracks in Zimbabwe. I think that really would be great.
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar problem here. I mean, they haven't even factored that in with the road construction. I don't even think urban planning has considered it before. So you would be taking your life into your hands if you decided to cycle on the main roads. But some of these small things, I mean, I'm just hoping that perhaps when we are in positions to influence policy, when we're in positions of authority, that we'll be able to do a bit better on this sort of thing. Actually, coming back to the plastic bottle issue, I was just thinking right now, like in Ghana, between plastic bottles and sachet water, you know, water that is packed in these plastic bags, how would you go about encouraging people not to drink that when there is a problem with water quality from the taps? So yeah, even people are reluctant, even if you boil water, to drink that water, or they don't trust filters. Like they're just like, oh no, it won't filter all the impurities out. What do then what do you do? Then people just feel like, oh, you know, I trust this brand of water, so I'm just going to continue buying it. Or maybe the best I'll do is get one of those water coolers. Is that what they're called? The water dispensers.
Yeah.
Where, like, the bottles can be reused.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I know some schools do that because they feel it reduces waste. Yeah, so sorry, suggestions.
Yeah, that's actually great. It's a challenge that we're facing in Africa. We cannot dispute it. The water quality is poor, and in some places you don't get water. Like in Zimbabwe, there are actually some places which haven't had water running from the tap for years now, you know. So you can imagine, like, where would you expect people to get that water? But I think the senses, let's put in that effort. So instead of buying the small bottles or the small plastics, why not just buy one big container, maybe a 10-liter container? I think here in Zimbabwe, we actually have shops that sell filtered water, and you can take your big containers and then you just buy the water and have it put directly into your own containers. So I think that is actually one sustainable way, instead of issuing the small plastic water bottles. And yeah, I think also sometimes you find that people that buy those small plastic papers, I've seen it in movies, in movies on the streets. I think it's always also good and safe to carry your water bottle. Yeah, so you have your water all the time, and you don't have to be buying plastic bottled water from the streets.
Yeah. No, that's actually very useful, just like on a day-to-day, what we can do to change. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
Okay, we're going to just allow about 10 more minutes. So if you have your questions, please get them in.
I'll say something.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Nobi.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for your amazing talk.
Thanks, Jay.
I totally resonated and agreed with everything you said, and you know, speaking about the representation of women in conservation sector in Zim, and yeah, I totally resonate. And you know, you've just hit the nail on the head on so many different sort of themes in your presentation, and I'm so glad that you've brought in the issue of plastic waste into the conversation, because since I've moved to Zim and been in the conservation sector, this is not really a topic that comes up much, actually. You know, I think plastic waste and pollution is often seen, it's been sort of an environmental sustainability issue. And then in a country like Zim, conservation is very much like wildlife protection, habitats, biodiversity protection, but it's all part of the same issue. And it's such an important conversation. And, you know, we're talking about educating communities and understanding their relationship with their environment and nature, and getting them involved in the conservation sort of story. But that can be said for everybody all over the world and urban areas as well. You know, you can say people are chopping down trees in rural areas and they don't understand the impact, but these are the same people who are not recycling, who are just, you know, churning out plastic bottles. So I think that what is needed is just more awareness, more advocacy, more education, because that's what leads to a change in thinking and a change in culture and a new value system, which is needed across the board, no matter what your economic system is, you know, from sort of the most rural communities to the most high-end areas of the world. Like, our value system needs to change, and that does take leadership. It takes community leaders. It takes people with strong voices, and I think that women can play a massive role in that, specifically, because I think we all agree, we've talked about education a lot on this call, and it is so important. And it's not just educating communities, it's educating the world about their impact, the impact of pollution, of what you're doing every day, like your daily habits, the impact it has, you know, the lights you have on your house. We all have to be so conscious of our environment, because we think from day to day and we don't think of the future and the impact of it. So yeah, I just wanted to actually make a comment and say thank you so much, and thank you for including that in the conversation. It's so important, and yeah, we must take that conversation forward again sometime when I see you again.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jay, for that. Yeah, it's a very important point. Thanks.
Great contributions. So I see something in the chat from Sarah. She says, thanks, Nobe. I think we need to introduce conservation education from primary level to ensure everyone understands conservation regardless of background. So yeah, coming back to education.
Yeah. It's true.
Very necessary. Yeah. Okay. Is anyone?
Good evening.
Oh, good evening.
Hi. Hello, Debbie. Hello, Novi.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm Kairo from Botswana. Eh? I'm your neighbor.
Oh, that's great. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks.
Thank you for the nice presentation. I kind of relate to the problems that we suffer as communities who are living closer to wildlife areas. You talked about the benefits not reaching out to those local communities. It's an issue even here in Botswana. You know, the people who benefit most from the revenues accrued from the tourism operations and wildlife, they are the people who are living in cities and in the urban areas, because as the tourism industry revenues are mostly as you know, channeled towards development in the cities and the urban areas. And this leaves out the local communities who bear the costs of wildlife damage and human-wildlife conflicts. But from the African perspective, you know, that is that is the nature of the development. We go to the urban areas. But are we really saying we want to sort of channel those monies to the local communities? Maybe one would ask, if you do that and develop those rural communities, don't you think you may be disturbing or influencing, you know, those developments there and suddenly distorting the whole nature of the area? For example, if you start building roads, infrastructures, electricities, and other things, you probably are now changing the whole landscape. How do you balance that? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Kaelo, for your question. That's a tough one. Hey, so recently, I think Africa has been having this debates with the World Heritage Convention, where we keep asking the question, how do we balance World Heritage and sustainable development? You know, there's so many restrictions that come, for instance, with the World Heritage Convention in terms of development in the buffer zones or closer to the protected areas, which are World Heritage sites, because they actually may have an impact on the scenic value and also on the outstanding universal value of the landscape. So yeah, that is very tricky. I think that the question also comes that we may need to ask is, how can we really achieve sustainable development and have very limited impact on the landscape and also within the local communities? So if we talk of the issue of power, for instance, which will require power lines, and we're saying that those might actually disturb the scenic value and also affect wildlife in the area, or they might actually be broken by wildlife as they walk maybe within those areas.
Debbie, you are also muted.
Oh, yes, I just realized. Okay, Nobe is back, thank goodness.
Yeah, I don't think I might have much time. The power keeps going off. You know, now it's late,
yeah,
so
we're
anytime it
supposed to end in about 2 minutes. So
okay, yeah. So I was saying that I think that we should also think of that. But also, if we think of the issues to do with amenities, those are really important. I think people need good health, and for us to have good health and also provide the facilities to the local communities, we do need those. So, you know, there are actually some trade-offs that we may have to consider. I mean, I think establishing just a hospital in a community and versus the loss of lives because you don't have a hospital, you know, we should try and achieve that win-win balance for conservation and also for development.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we really have to strive to strike a balance between the rural and the urban communities. Otherwise, you know, rural communities are our conservationists. So we need to take care of them, you know. Thank you for your responses.
And thank you so much, Nobe, for joining us. This has been very enlightening. I think sometimes it's easy to feel like you've heard some of these things before, but I learned a lot today. I mean, I did not even know the EU had an agenda. I've been thinking, you know, what is the EU, sorry, I said EU, AU doing? What is the AU doing? How are they prioritizing conservation work? So it's very heartening to know that this is something that's being looked at. I'm hoping that we can move things forward in a shorter time period. But yeah, I mean, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Great. This was great. I hope that you'll be able to join us for more over coffee sessions when you have the time. I know you're busy. But thank you so much, everyone else, for joining in. Nobe, I'm just going to give you the last word. You know, what do you want us to leave with? I know you had some points at the end of your presentation, but what's like a one point? What's one point you'd like to leave us with?
Just a sentence.
Okay.
Yeah, we are the future, and we really need to ensure that the decisions that we're making now will actually reflect good on us, even for the coming generations. So yeah, make the right decisions now, and yeah, make an impact on conservation, play a role. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I hope everyone has a great rest of the evening. Please stay safe. Please do your bit to move this conservation effort forward. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.